The 30-day food cure has three phases or three areas of focus, and we'll go through each of these and explain them in this video. The goal of the 30-day food cure is to bring a person back to a new foundation, essentially rebuilding their foundation of their health, so that you can be free of any current symptoms and health problems and enjoy the long and healthy life that you and all of us are meant to live. Before we can achieve that goal, we need to sort of clean the slate and fix a few things so that we can help your body remember what it feels like to be healthy again. So this brings us to phase one of the 30-day food cure. Phase one consists of eating most of your foods that are closer to their food source, which means closer to their natural state as found in nature. This does not mean recommending that you eat a strictly raw foods type diet, although eating more foods that are raw probably would be a beneficial thing for a lot of people just because of the extra nutrients and enzymes and stuff that we find within food before it's been cooked. It means though that you're eating foods that have not been tampered with, processed, or preserved, or minimizing your consumption of those foods as much as you can. I believe we will likely start to see a bigger shift over the next few decades to more people eating food that has been locally grown instead of food that's had to travel 1,000 miles to get to you and to get to your dinner table, simply because the locally grown food is going to be the freshest and the healthiest for you and your family. The second part of phase one of the 30-day food cure is to also change the ratio of your food intake to a much lower carbohydrate intake, while at the same time increasing your daily intake of healthy fats. It's important to note that you can't just do one, meaning you can't only lower your carbohydrate intake or you can't only increase your healthy fats. They need to be done together to see the best long-term success and the best health benefits. So why is this so important? It all comes down to controlling glucose or blood sugar and insulin levels in your blood. So in order to see your body weight and overall health improve more quickly, your goal will be to keep your glucose or your blood sugar levels and your insulin levels below a certain level, or what I'm calling a threshold or a red line here, and to keep it below that on a daily basis every day. So what happens in your body when you eat anything that has a higher amount of sugar or a higher amount of carbohydrates? Well, pretty quickly after, we're going to see, after consuming something that has more sugar or higher carbohydrates, we're going to see your blood sugar levels or your glucose actually shoot up above and go higher than that threshold. And the problem with this is that when your blood sugar rises and it goes above that threshold, this pushes your body into what I call a fat storing mode. The body does not want to allow you to lose any excess or stored body fat when blood sugar levels go too high and when they stay above that threshold. But this is only half the problem, because when blood sugar levels go up, we also will see that insulin levels will go up, because insulin is the hormone that moves that sugar or that glucose out of the blood and gets it into your cells. And the problem is that insulin on its own is also another fat storing hormone, in that when insulin levels go above that threshold, it's going to prevent your body from wanting to get into a fat burning mode. It's going to be very difficult to lose any excess body weight or body fat. So it's essentially sort of a double whammy, so to speak, in that blood sugar alone increasing above that threshold is going to put your body into a fat storing mode. Insulin on its own will do the same thing. But when you're eating anything that has a higher amount of sugar and carbohydrate, it actually pushes both of them beyond that threshold, and your body simply is not going to want to lose weight or lose its excess body fat until both the blood sugar and insulin levels drop back down below that threshold. So the best scenario is to be eating in such a way that both glucose and insulin stay at a healthy lower level, meaning below that threshold every day. We accomplish this goal of keeping glucose and insulin levels at a healthy level or below that threshold by eating a diet that is lower in carbohydrates and at the same time increasing your intake of healthy fats. But it's very important to note that you need to do these together. If you don't do them together, here's what will often happen. So this represents the ratio that most people have been eating for the past few decades in what I'm calling the 30-day or the 30-year food experiment. which has resulted in a sharp increase in obesity, diabetes, and other health problems. So we can see that the carbohydrates make up the majority of the kinds of foods that people are eating, and the fats make up the lowest. So what will happen if the only change you make is to be eating less carbohydrates, to look at a ratio that looks like this? You, in fact, probably will lose some weight, but eventually the hunger and the cravings will likely overpower your commitment, and you'll start letting more carbohydrates back into your diet because those cravings and that hunger becomes very, very powerful to the point where it just becomes too difficult to keep working against that. So you need to make sure that when you're lowering your carbohydrate intake that you offset this by increasing your intake of healthy fats. This will make up for the loss of energy or fuel from eating less carbs, plus that increase of healthy fats will satisfy you longer and help to get rid of those hunger and cravings. So to state it simply, in phase 1 of the 30-day food cure, we need to change the ratio of our food intake from this, where carbohydrates are higher and fats are lower, and basically reverse that ratio to look like this, where our carbohydrates and our sugars and carbs are the lowest portion, and our healthy fats become a much larger portion of the diet. Notice also that protein intake has remained moderate, so the recommendation is not to be eating a real high protein diet, because you can actually eat too much protein where that actually results in you gaining weight as well. So as I explain this strategy of lowering your carbohydrate intake and increasing your intake of healthy fats, I can almost imagine that for some of you the wheels are starting to turn, and there's likely a few questions that are coming to mind for some of you. Questions like, isn't eating more fat going to make me fat? Or what about the fact that fat has more calories in it compared to carbs and protein? Or what about that original concern of higher fat intake and how that relates to cardiovascular health that was the reason for that original recommendation back in the late 70s or early 80s to be eating lower fat? What about that connection? What's going on there? These are all great questions to be asking, so let's take a closer look at these. So one common question is, isn't eating more fat going to make me fat, or going to make your body more fat? Certainly eating too much of anything can result in gaining weight, but when you offset the increase of eating more healthy fats with eating fewer or less carbohydrates, it's quite unlikely that you will gain weight. In fact, it's more likely the opposite will happen. People usually end up losing weight. This is because eating more healthy fat will have you feel more full and more satisfied for a longer period of time. You'll be less hungry, and most people end up eating fewer calories each day because they are simply less hungry. So what about the fact that fat has more calories in it compared to carbohydrates and proteins? It is true that fat has more calories in it than both carbohydrates and proteins. Fat, in fact, has nearly double the calories. But again, eating more healthy fat will have you feel more full or more satisfied after a meal for a longer period of time. The end result is that most people then usually eat less food and therefore less calories throughout the day. What about the original concern of higher fat intake and how that relates to cardiovascular health? It's a great question. Let's take a look at what the more recent research is telling us about this. So here we see, when we're looking at this question of what does the more recent research indicate on the link between dietary fat intake and cardiovascular disease or risk of cardiovascular problems. Here's some of the research within the past 5 years, highlighting in red the main points of that piece of research. So the first one here shows that there's insufficient evidence of an association is present on the connection between fat intake and cardiovascular health or disease. The second one, there were no clear effects of dietary fat changes on total mortality or cardiovascular mortality. Number 3, no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease or coronary heart disease. Number 4, evidence does not support the hypothesis that dietary fat or high-fat dairy foods contribute to obesity or cardiometabolic risk. So here we have quite a big conflict of information from what was the thinking back in the late 70s to early 80s. The more recent research is telling us that this in fact is not the case. In fact, there is far more evidence to support the idea that a low carbohydrate diet versus a low fat diet is much better to help you lose weight. That weight loss and healthier body weight then results in a lower risk of cardiovascular problems. So I'm not going to bother reading through all these different kind of names of research articles, but here's one page, another page, a third page. There is an overwhelming amount of research to support this idea that it is not a low-fat diet that's your best option. It's a low-carbohydrate diet. But again, we have to offset that intake of lower carbohydrates by increasing your healthy fat intake. So here is a summary of what we currently know. The original recommendation from the early 1980s to eat a low-fat diet that resulted in the food pyramid has also created a sharp increase in the number of people who are overweight and obese over the past 30 years. This concern for cardiovascular health that resulted in the original recommendation for Americans to be eating a low-fat diet is a concern that is simply not supported or shown to be not correct by more recent research. The more recent research clearly shows that a low-carbohydrate diet creates greater improvements in weight loss and cardiovascular health, especially when compared to a low-fat diet. And then eating more healthy fats on a daily basis does not make you more fat. It is necessary to be eating more healthy fats to offset the decrease in carbohydrates, as this will help you to control your hunger and cravings, and usually you'll feel more full after a meal, and then you end up eating fewer calories overall during the day. So if you're still not convinced, let's take a closer look at more popular media. Here we saw what I'd shown before, this Time magazine cover from March of 1984 that was sharing with the world that fat is bad. So then let's fast forward almost exactly 30 years later to June of 2014. The new Time magazine cover says, "Eat butter. Scientists labeled fat as the enemy and they were wrong." So quite a contrast in that 30-year time frame in what I'm also calling that 30-year food experiment. The original thinking was fat was bad, but now we know based on more recent research that fat is not the enemy. And in fact, an increased intake of healthy fats can be extremely beneficial to your body and to your diet. So what does this mean? So what this means is that you have been an unknowing participant in what I'm calling the 30-year food experiment. Now the experiment is over, the data is in, and it is now time to change the way you're eating to a strategy that we now know is much healthier for your body. It's what we've learned from this 30-year food experiment that leads us to the recommendations in phase 1 of the 30-day food cure, which is for you to be eating a diet that is much lower in carbohydrates and increasing your intake of healthy fats. But there's still one more thing to consider when deciding which foods you want to be putting into your body. This leads